US-Medien zufolge hängt die zukünftige US-Unterstützung für die Ukraine maßgeblich von den Erfolgen der ukrainischen Frühjahrsoffensive ab. Ist das tatsächlich so, oder wird hier medial bereits ein mögliches Abwenden der NATO von der Ukraine vorbereitet?
According to U.S. media, the future U.S. support for Ukraine depends largely on the success of Ukraine's spring offensive. Is this really the case? Or is the media here already preparing for a possible turning away of NATO from Ukraine?
I think this is the media trying to come to grips with the reality of what's unfolding in Ukraine today. I think it's a gross oversimplification of the U.S. position. I think the United States has committed to a long-term policy of supporting Ukraine when it comes to Russia. This policy is limited by reality, but I haven't heard any U.S. government official come straight out and say that if Ukraine doesn't win its counteroffensive, the U.S. will cease support. This is a media spin on this. What the U.S. has said is that this may be Ukraine's last opportunity for meaningful military advances because the West is losing the capacity to continue to supply Ukraine with the military equipment that makes continued resistance possible, so that Ukraine will be in a more difficult political position going forward if it doesn't prevail. That's a more nuanced take than what the media is saying. The media, I think, is preparing its own audience for the inevitability of a Ukrainian defeat.
In Frankreich haben die Behörden 2 Neonazis verhaftet, die als Söldner für die Ukraine gekämpft haben. Sie hatten bei ihrer Rückkehr eine große Zahl an Waffen mitgebracht. Ähnliche Absichten sind auch bei deutschen Neonazis vom Dritten Weg bekannt geworden. Wie schätzen Sie die Gefahr ein, dass Waffen aus der Ukraine in die Hände von extremistischen Gruppen im Westen fallen?
In France, the authorities have arrested 2 neo-Nazis who fought as mercenaries for Ukraine. They had brought a large number of weapons with them on their return. Similar intentions have also become known among German neo-Nazis from the Third Reich. How do you assess the danger of weapons from Ukraine falling into the hands of extremist groups in the West?
Well, this has always been a problem. Ukraine has for some time enjoyed the reputation of being one of the most corrupt countries in Europe and indeed in the world. And this corruption extends across a broad spectrum of issues, including weapons. And then we turn around and we supply Ukraine with a seemingly infinite amount of weaponry with no accountability. The United States, was confronted by this by Senator Rand Paul last spring when he said, we can't be giving $45 billion worth of military assistance without some sort of accounting mechanism in place. But the rest of Congress voted to override him and give this anyways. We now have an understanding that between 60 and 70% of the money and the material that's provided to Ukraine disappears into the pockets of people in an unaccounted fashion. And when you have a Ukrainian government that has been hijacked by neo-Nazi ideologues, the supporters of Stepan Bandera, who have made common cause with criminal elements, racist neo-Nazi elements, it's inevitable that the weaponry provided by the West will become kind of currency that's used in the black market, where there is continued connectivity between Ukraine, the rest of Europe, and indeed the world. So this is a very big problem, both in terms of the weaponry and the people who are trafficking this, the neo-Nazis. Look, the ideological progeny of Adolf Hitler should never be allowed to exist on Europe ever again, and yet they are thriving in Ukraine.
Schauen wir auf die Taiwan-Krise. Der EU-Außenbeauftragte Josep Borrell fordert, die EU solle Kriegsschiffe in die Taiwanstraße schicken. Er spricht sich zudem für die faktische Lostrennung Taiwans vom chinesischen Mutterland aus. Was bezweckt Borrell mit solchen Aussagen? Können EU-Kriegsschiffe China einschüchtern?
Let's have a view on the Taiwan crisis. EU High Representative for Foreign Affairs Joseph Borrell demands the EU should send warships to the Taiwan Strait. He also advocates the de facto separation of Taiwan from mainland China. What is Borrell trying to achieve with such statements? Can EU warships really intimidate China?
The European Union's relevance with China is non-existent. China controls Europe. Europe doesn't control China. China can shut down the European economy. Europe can't touch the Chinese economy. And the idea of European warships going to Taiwan is it's a tragic joke because, one, there is no European fleet worthy of the name. Two, if any European ships did make it to Taiwan, they would suffer the fate of ships such as the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. These are two British Navy ships during World War II that were sunk by the Japanese, off near Singapore. This would be the fate of any European Union fleet that dared venture into the Pacific. Europe has problems in Europe, in its own backyard. The idea that Europe's going to somehow flex muscle and intimidate China is it's not even a joke. I mean, a joke has humor. This is just stupidity.
In der Argumentation des Westens wird zunehmend von der Konfrontation zweier Blöcke gesprochen. Auf der einen Seite der NATO-Westen, auf der anderen Seite Russland, China und ihre Verbündeten. Wie sehen Sie das? Steuern wir auf ein neues 1914 zu, als sich zwei Militärblöcke in einen blutigen Weltkrieg verwickelt haben?
The West's argumentation increasingly speaks of the confrontation of two blocs. On the one side, the NATO-West, on the other, Russia, China, and their allies. How do you see this? Are we heading for a new 1914 when two military blocs were engaged in a bloody world war?
I mean, that's always a potential when you're talking about Europe and military blocs. But this time it's different. In 1914, you had two blocs that were mobilizing. And one of the problems is that the mobilization took place unfettered. Once it started, it couldn't be stopped, so war became inevitable. Here we have two countries, Ukraine and Russia, that have engaged in a form of mobilization. Ukraine, near total mobilization, Russia, partial mobilization. NATO hasn't mobilized at all. And so it's hard to even think about NATO putting together a credible military force that could operate on the ground in Ukraine. The question has to come, what force? What German divisions are going to be sent to Ukraine? Does Germany have any divisions? What British divisions will be sent? We know they don't have any divisions. What French divisions will be sent? No, they've got enough problems as it is. Is Italy going to send divisions? NATO has divisions on paper, but when it comes time to turn these paper divisions into reality, NATO has nothing. They have a hard time getting tanks out of the barracks. They have a hard time maintaining equipment. They have no ammunition. Their manpower hasn't trained for this kind of fighting. Which NATO army is trained in division size, corps size, combined arms maneuver warfare? The answer is only one, and that's the United States. No other NATO force can claim to have that kind of capability. General Cavoli, the commander of NATO forces, the American four-star general, in January, speaking to a Swedish defense forum, accurately noted that the war in Ukraine is beyond the scope and imagination of NATO, meaning NATO could never imagine the level of violence that's taking place in Ukraine today, which means NATO hasn't trained for it, NATO isn't prepared for it, they aren't equipped for it, they can't sustain it. So there is no threat of a World War III, because to be a World War III, you have to have one side fighting another side. What is NATO? This is like a kindergartner saying that he wants to get into the boxing ring with Muhammad Ali at his prime. It's not even worth talking about.
Auf den Punkt. Könnte der NATO-Westen eine militärische Konfrontation gegen eine russisch-chinesische Allianz gewinnen, würde so eine Konfrontation automatisch zu einem Atomkrieg führen?
To the point. Could the NATO-West win a military confrontation against a Russian-Chinese alliance? Would such a confrontation automatically lead to nuclear war?
I believe that a NATO-Russian conflict would lead to nuclear war for this reason. Because NATO would be so decisively defeated by Russia early on conventionally that NATO would have no choice but to fall back on nuclear weapons to preserve their their ability to survive. NATO has no chance of defeating Russia in a straight-up conventional fight. In order for this to happen, NATO would have to mobilize. Which NATO country has mobilized? Not a single one. So if there was to be a fight, a conventional fight between Russia and NATO, NATO would almost immediately lose, which means the only weapon they have is the nuclear weapon, which means the end of the world. So now we come back to the start. NATO generals know this. General Cavoli knows this. Every NATO general knows this, that if they got into a fight with Russia today, they would lose decisively, and it would go nuclear, and everybody dies. So let's stop talking about a NATO-Russia conflict. It just isn't going to happen.
Wenden wir uns den USA zu. US-Präsident Joe Biden hat verkündet, 2024 für seine Wiederwahl zu kandidieren. Er ist dann 82 Jahre alt. In Umfragen hatte Biden zuletzt äußerst schlecht abgeschnitten. Warum setzt das US-Establishment weiter auf Biden? Was würde seine Nominierung für den US-Wahlkampf bedeuten? Was für die Republikaner rund um Ex-Präsident Donald Trump?
Let's turn to the USA. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced that he will run for re-election in 2024. He will then be 82 years old. In recent polls, Biden has performed extremely poorly. Why does the U.S. establishment continue to back Biden? What would his nomination mean for the U.S. election campaign and for the Republicans around former President Donald Trump?
Look, it's a sad state of affairs when a nation like the United States with 320 plus million people, the best we can do is put up Joe Biden and Donald Trump as our presidential candidates. Neither one of them are adequate individuals. Joe Biden has a long history of incompetence in the United States Senate and as a vice president. His former colleagues have said that he has never been right at all on any national security issue. He is the worst man possible for the presidency, with possibly one exception, and that's Donald Trump. And yet these are the two guys that are there. Fortunately, Joe Biden is going to be challenged in the primary by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a very competent man, an intelligent man, an articulate man, whose political legacy dates back to John F. Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy. I think that Joe Biden may not be able to withstand a primary challenge, especially from somebody like Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And one of the things is that the establishment likes Joe Biden because Joe Biden is the establishment. But Joe Biden's physical deterioration is obvious to anybody watching him. I don't mean to be cruel. It's not my goal. I respect my elders, and I think they should be cherished. But at some point in time, we have to recognize that age is a limiting factor. Not for everybody. Everybody should be evaluated as individuals. I have a good friend named Seymour Hersh, who you might be familiar with, your audience, the Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist who exposed the Nord Stream attacks. He's 85 years old. His brain is as sharp as a tack. I would trust him with any intellectual problem. And I challenge anybody to get on the tennis court with him. Seymour Hersh would beat them. So age isn't by and of itself the problem. It's the individual and how they have aged. And Joe Biden is not aging well. His physical deterioration, his cognitive deterioration are obvious for everybody to see, and it's only going to get worse. So Americans have to ask themselves, do they want a shell of a man to be president? Do they want a man who can't think, who can't operate, who can't function normally to be in control of America's nuclear arsenal? And that's a fair question that people are going to have to ask. And so I think that it is a factor, age is a factor, and it will probably prevent Joe Biden from being president for another term.